You know, we've been talking about the attempts of Agenda 21 and other things to try to take over our cities, our countryside, and so forth, deny property rights. Well, who is causing this and why? Well, if you look back to 1966, there's a book published called Tragedy and Hope, written by Carroll Quigley, who is known as the foremost historian of the 20th century. He was a professor of Georgetown University. He was one of Bill Clinton's mentors at the time, and he wrote in 1966 a 1,310-page history book of the global elite and what they did, and he was proud of it. He agreed with them. He had been working with them for 20 years, and for 2 years they had given him access to all their financial records. So he knew what he was talking about. He had all the original documentation as he wrote this book. And in this book, he says that the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economic system of the world as a whole. Now, that's a mouthful, isn't it? How many times have people said that this is an attempt to create a world government and been declared and lambasted as being a conspiracy nut? It's true. They have always been doing this for years and years, since at least the turn of this 20th century, and have made tremendous progress, as we will see in a moment. He goes on in this same quote to say the system was able to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion. Now, what does that mean? It means that there's going to be no middle class. There are going to be the royalty and the serfs. And guess where you and I are going to be? We will be the serfs. Controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements. The apex of this system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. A private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. I hope that all of you know that the U.S. Federal Reserve is not a government entity. It's not an agency of the government. It's not a department of the government. It's privately owned by about 130 or so families. Most of them are European, not American. How did they do it? How did these international people do this, these financiers? They started in the 17th and 18th century by turning churches from the gospel to social justice. It's happening even today, as churches turn from the gospel of Jesus Christ to one of social justice and basically the rights of every individual to have an equal share of all the resources, money, and so forth. Not an equal opportunity as guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States, but an equal share. They have demonized anyone who opposes them. And I hope by now, and I'm seeing this throughout the country, that there is this tendency to realize now by most Americans, as the people who are the forefront of the Tea Party movement keep getting called racists and demagogues and haters and all of these slanderous names. And they're just like you and I. In fact, many of you here are probably part of that. And you're beginning to realize that all of this demonization through all the decades over the last 100 years has been false. It's been the only way they can take your eyes off of the truth and put them on what they want you to see. So if you see CBS, NBC, and so forth demonizing someone or something, chances are, now you have to investigate, but chances are what they're trying to do is to get your eyes off of what they're saying, which is probably the truth, and onto a lie. Turn Christian colleges like Harvard and Yale and so forth to secular ones. Indoctrinated public school teachers with socialist principles so that they don't even know they're teaching socialism to our kids in the public school system. Our public schools have become literally indoctrination centers for our children. Now, I know not all of you can send your kids to, or homeschool your kids or send them to private schools, but if it's all possible, try to teach them at home or send them to a private or Christian school, because they are not getting an education in the public school system unless you spend a lot of time with them when they get home, going over what they have learned and talking about it and sharing with them what the reality or the truth and so forth is. And I know that's a big job, but it's your kids that are involved. Your kids are being lied to. They're indoctrinated with entire generations of students with revisionist history and no critical thinking. I've been astonished at how bad our history books are. Now, when I was their age in school, I could care less about history. Probably many of you didn't care about it either. But as I begin to realize how important Christian history is, I begin to study it and have been astonished at what I had missed. History is extremely important. How can a student graduate from high school with an understanding of what his nation or her nation is if they don't know the historical roots, or the historical roots have been warped and changed into something totally different than what it truly is? When I was in Salt Lake City last week giving the same talk, I had one of the people in the audience tell me that there was a history book in all of the school system in the Salt Lake City area that declared that the United States of America was a democracy. And when the student challenged that and said to his teacher and said that it was a constitutional republic, he was reprimanded and told to sit down and shut up. He went home, told his parents, and his parents came to talk to the teacher, and he says, the teacher said that to the parents, you do not know what you're talking about. I am the expert here. Get out. They filed a lawsuit, and they won. Sometimes it takes that kind of courage and action to bring truth to the schoolroom and the classroom. That book no longer is in the Salt Lake City curricula. I don't think that the teacher really fully understood that the United States wasn't a democracy. Our founding fathers hated democracy. They said it's the worst form of government you can have. Why? Because it's like two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. And it always self-destructs. We have a constitutional republic in which the states created the federal government. The federal government did not create the states. And that is of paramount importance later on in the discussion. Penetrated the judicial system with activist judges who actually changed the law. Many of our so-called rights have been turned 180 degrees on their heads. I'm not going to go into all of them. I think you probably know what many of them are. Indoctrinated journalist schools into socialist worldviews, so that our journalists today don't even know they're being biased. And I'll be talking about that in a moment. They've attacked private property rights, as we've already discussed, and they've demonized all opposition. Why? Because they have had the mainstream media in their pockets for about 70 years. Now, the plan to rule the world goes on to say that it's increasingly clear that in the 20th century, the expert will replace the democratic voter in control of the political system. This is because planning will inevitably replace the laissez-faire in the relationship between the government and business. This planning may not be a single or unified, but it will be planning in which the main framework and the operational forces of the economic system will be established and limited by the experts on the government side. And then the experts on the economic side will do their planning within these established limitations. So rather than having unalienable property rights, what they're basically doing is they're bringing in the limits as to what your rights are to a very narrow range, And you can make decisions within that range, but you cannot make them in areas where it would benefit you, but it's outside the place where they say you can go. That is European socialism. And we are heading down the same road as Europe has already traveled. That the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economic. Professor of Georgetown University, he was one of Bill Clinton's mentors at the time, and he wrote in 1966 a 1,310-page history book of the global elite and what they did, and he was proud of it. He agreed with them. Well, who is causing this and why? Well, if you look back to 1966, there's a book published called Tragedy and Hope, written by Carroll Quigley, who is known as the foremost historian of the 20th century. He was a professor. He had been working with them for 20 years. And for 2 years, they had given him access to all their financial records. So he knew what he was talking about. He had all the original documentation as he wrote this book. And in this book, he says, we've been talking about the attempts of Agenda 21 and other things to try to take over our cities, our countryside, and so forth, deny property rights.